Dave Murphy is holding one of our first F5J contests on July 15th and 16th. So we wanted some opportunity to talk about F5J and a chance to publicize it a bit. And I think Chris's talk today is just perfect for that. And a lot of us are thermal duration people, so we're not always super comfortable with you know, how electric motors work and how the rules work. And I think just the more we kind of mix it up with thermal duration and electric motors, I think is electric motor launch is just really healthy for the club and really good for kind of bringing in new people into the hobby. So we're all excited about that. And we're super excited about having Chris here to speak. He's been doing F5J for years, and he's pretty famous on the coast about this. He runs the RC groups for F5J, and he also is a part of the advisory group for this interesting area of our hobby. So I think with that introduction, I'll try to turn it over to you, Chris, without losing the connection.
Let me start by saying how much I appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone today about F5J. This is obviously a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and a little bit about myself before we get into it. I live near Sacramento. I actually live in a small country town, Penryn. If you've ever gone up to Lake Tahoe, you've passed within a couple of miles of where I live. Been in RC soaring since the mid-1990s, mostly doing flying out of the Sacramento Club SVSS. We have a field out in Davis. I love contesting. Most of what I do is contesting or practicing for contests. That's my my central area of interest in RC. I am currently webmaster. I actually created the F5J-USA.com website over the winter, and am founder and chairman of the F5J USA Tour, which is something we'll talk about in a couple of slides. So the outline I have for topics to cover tonight, going to take about a half an hour to get through them, and at the end I'll leave time for questions and answers. But while I'm talking, if there are questions on a specific slide, I do not have a problem with you just piping up with a question. Just make sure it's loud enough I can hear you. So we're going to talk about first of all, just basically what is F5J. Obviously it's a contest format, but we'll talk about some of the particulars. Give you a little bit of history on some of the different electric-based contests that have been popular both in the US and Europe. We'll talk about what happened this winter, which has become really the catalyst for all the activity that we're seeing this year in F5J in the US. Then we'll talk about F5J rules, scoring, and strategy, since many of you, as Walt indicated, are not really into electric contesting so much. So we'll talk about the details of that just to give you a bit of a prelude before you either enter your first F5J or before you go watch your first F5J contest, which I think is kind of a neat idea. It's as much a spectator sport as any I have ever seen. It's pretty exciting. And then we'll talk just briefly about the event that's scheduled at Hollister, the first SBSS F5J event, and then we'll take some time for Q&A. So first, in terms of just the most fundamental points, what is F5J? It is an electric man-on-man contest format, and I know South Bay, when they do TD contests, they're one of the clubs that does TD in a modified man-on-man format. So F5J is a true man-on-man format, just like F3J, upon which F5J was patterned after. So there are a fair number of rules, equivalents, and similarities. For example, the concept of doing your flights within a period of working time, 10-minute working time periods for contest rounds that are preliminary or qualifying, and then if the contest is big enough to be justified as having a set of fly-off rounds, they're 15-minute rounds. In F5J, there is the concept of increasing penalties based on your launch height, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but this is one of the key differences between other contest formats in RC soaring, and F5J, and it is one of the more interesting ones to talk about. There is a decreased emphasis on landings. As many of you know, both with F5J and with TD, if the conditions are good, contests often turn into landing precision contests. That does not happen in F5J. In F5J, it's all about strategy and thermaling skills, and I'll explain more about that in a second. I heard it referred this way when comparing AILS, the electric format, compared to F5J. AILS is checkers and F5J is chess, and that really is a very good comparative description of the difference in terms of, you know, the pilot's view of what it's like to fly in each one of those types of contests. So a little bit of e-contest history, contrasting the U.S. against Europe from the perspective of when electric planes started getting popular in contests. The U.S. started AILS at approximately the same time that Europe started F5J. In Europe, the first pre-FAI F5J contest started in 2008, 2009, and the earliest AILS contest in the U.S. started in 2010. So basically, they all happened about the same time, which you would expect given the technology that was available. In the Western U.S., Phoenix was the first club to do organized F5J. In fact, their first F5J contest was October 18th in 2014. That club has been going steady with F5J almost every month since then. SDSS 2 years ago did a contest series that was a total of 4 events. It was not really well attended. We had maybe an average of maybe 6 to 8 pilots each time, but it was lots of fun. And I have to give a shout out to Francesco and Don for being among the guys who came to almost every one of those events. So they, and Francesco had lots of F5J experience with his contesting that he had done in Europe before. So he was a tremendous help in giving us all some feedback and understanding of what F5J was all about. So anyway, they were there in the beginning too as far as U.S. activity. So this winter, there were a number of things that happened that became the catalyst for what is now a very popular format all of a sudden in the U.S. I started a website, F5J-USA.com, which started with an event calendar and some rules and an F5J primer, which is still there. But now it's been added to also give information about the F5J USA Tour, which was also formed in the latter part of the winter. And that tour, the goal of it is to provide a series of regional U.S. contests and also to be sort of the core F5J marketing entity for just keeping F5J in the minds of RC contesters. The advisory group that runs our tour has very knowledgeable, very experienced people helping out. I'm its chairman. We have Lee Wolf, who is the key F5J and contest organizer for the Phoenix Club. Steve New, who is responsible for a whole bunch of motor development in his own company and for getting the word out about how motors can best be effectively used in these kinds of planes. Lenny Keir, pilot in Colorado, who has lots and lots of contest experience and he's extremely well versed. Larry Jolly, who almost everybody in our sport, our hobby knows. Larry is on our advisory group. And then Jim Monaco, who has tons of operational experience running the F3J Tour, and he has been an immense help in helping us form the F5J Tour. So we've got a pretty good set of folks helping us out here. Now let's get into, I'll try and go through these rule slides fairly quickly. If any one of the slides has a point on it that I'm going through a little bit too quickly and you want some amplification, let me know, because I don't plan on rolling back through the rules a second time. So in F5J, you are allowed under FAI rules to use up to 3 planes. Maximum wingspan's 4 meters. You are not allowed to use an altitude cutoff or altitude telemetry equipment at all. And there's a reason why that has to do with the way the launches work. We'll talk about that in a second. You must have a special type of limiter, which in the FAI rules they refer to as an AMRT. And then there are no skegs allowed, which up until this year was also true for AILs. There have been some changes in the rules that do allow that now. So the details on these limiters that you put in your plane, they record and display on a little display on the device itself that's in your fuselage. The max height that your plane achieved during the launch phase between the start of the motor turning on and 10 seconds after cutoff. That start height that it records becomes the basis for how many penalty points you get assessed for the launch. And if it isn't obvious, the lower you launch, the more flight points you get per round. It also restricts the motor run time to 30 seconds, which is just like AILs. And in the case of the F5J USA Tour events, there are both one-day and two-day events. We are allowing emergency motor restarts to happen. So if you get your plane way far away and you decide you want to bring it back, you can, but you get a zero flight for it. But it's, it's more of a safety thing for your plane and, just so you can get it back. The flights, there are a minimum of 4 qualifying rounds in a contest. And the concept of reflights in F5J is different than F3J. You get to do a reflight if your plane has a midair or if your flight is hindered due to some unexpected event. For example, if somebody is crossing over lanes when you're trying to land, that would be considered an unexpected event that would qualify you for doing a reflight. But the reflight then becomes a completely new round. It's not like you have to land and launch again. There are a number of conditions where you get zero flights, again, like TD and AILs. This is a list of them. For example, if you launch further than 4 meters away from the landing spot, you get a zero flight. If your plane lands more than 75 meters away from the landing tape spot, zero flight, and so forth. So. Working times, I mentioned the qualifying rounds working times, or if it's a one-day contest for a monthly contest, usually you don't do fly-offs. Those would be all 10-minute rounds. If you do fly-offs, they're 15-minute rounds. In terms of launching, the launch direction is set by the CD. So you have the option, because the planes are electric, the CD, if the winds shift, he can change the launch and land direction. As I said before, you have to launch within 4 meters of the landing spot. The launches have to start straight ahead, but within a second or two, if there's downwind air, you can turn and burn and go downwind. There's no restriction on that. The motor cannot start until you hear the start horn, and you cannot throw or launch your plane unless the motor is on. So that all those things together constitute a legal F5J launch. Landing direction is also set by the CD. That is not like F3J. So this can even change mid-flight. If the winds shift and the CD wants to call it while all the planes are in the air, he can do that. So you do have to be prepared for that. And there is a discard round in F5J. If you fly more than 4 qualifying rounds, then there is one discard. So in the last 2 contests that I've been to, the F5J 2-day contest, pilots have been very thankful for that. Very thankful. All the zero flights are discard candidates, so if you happen to have a flight zeroed out due to some penalty, that can also be discarded. And there are no discards allowed in the fly-offs. Fly-offs are at the option of the CD. It used to be they were required, but in the FAI rules now it's not required. The top 30% of pilots will end up moving to the fly-off rounds, and they're either usually 3 or 4 rounds for the fly-offs. And that's when things usually get pretty interesting. It's when the more aggressive flying typically happens. Qualifying round scores do not carry over into the fly-offs. So if you're skilled enough to make it to the fly-offs, it gets reset to 0 before you start. So in terms of scoring, you're scoring the clock, if you will, starts at the release of your plane and stops when your plane either lands or when the end signal happens. The scoring is 1 point per second. You throw away the fractional seconds. And if you overfly the end signal, if your plane is still in the air, you get 0 landing points, but you still get your time. Now, this is where the core of F5J enters in terms of, well, you know, what benefit is it if I'm able to launch lower than everybody else? Well, the answer is that your penalty for launching becomes less. And this becomes, in many cases, the distinguishing factor that allows you to, you know, place higher than your nearing pilot, not because you landed better. So the start height is the highest point between motor on and 10 seconds after motor off. If you're interested in exploring that further, you can go up on f5j-usa.com and go to the F5J primer page, and there's actually a selection that shows you more about this. The start height itself is rounded down to the nearest meter, and the penalty is calculated as follows. It's a half a point per meter up to a launch height of 200 meters. If you go above 200 meters, it all of a sudden becomes a 3 point per meter penalty. So what do you suppose happens in a typical contest when the conditions are bad? Guys want to get up to 200, but they don't want to go higher than 200. But they can't use they can't use an altitude cutoff, and they also can't use telemetry. So what they have to do is get good at estimating where 200 is. That's part of the skill set you acquire when you practice F5J. The landing bonus, you get a 50-point max landing for a standard FAI 10-meter tape. And I want to point out the reason why I said earlier F5J contests never turn into landing shootouts is that the 50-point zone is a 2-meter wide circle. That is a big circle. And if you look at contests, even just the last couple of contests in the U.S., there was one in Visalia a couple of weeks ago, and then there was one in Las Vegas at the end of April. And if you look at all of those, well, with Vegas it was a little different because it was very windy, but in a typical contest, most of the pilots are going to be getting 45s and 50s. It's rare when that doesn't happen. And you get 0 landing bonus if you overfly the working time signal. I think I mentioned that before. So your total score for an F5J round is your duration points at 1 point per second, your landing bonus up to 50 points, minus the start height penalty. And then all of that gets normalized. The top pilot for a given round gets 1,000, and everybody gets normalized below him. So on the subject of, well, what's different between F5J when you're flying in that kind of contest as compared to, for example, AILS or TD? And the answer is you want to fly well enough to make the fly-offs, but when you're flying in the preliminaries, you certainly don't want to get too aggressive, because if you do and you miss one of your rounds, you don't get your time, it pretty much knocks you out. So you want to get your first duration, your full duration. And there is no restriction on how high you can launch in F5J. There's no limit. But I have a little side note where it says 336 meters. 336 meters is the height where if you launch that high, and that is pretty darn high, you completely zero out any possible score you would get for your time. So it's generally not a good idea to launch that high. But you can if you want to. Most guys, when conditions are bad, they will launch sometimes even a bit above 200, but it's rare when guys launch much more than, say, 230, 240 meters, just in practice. So you don't have to worry strategy-wise about the landings as much because they are actually easier. And one of the nice things about that is you don't have to worry so much about dorking your plane, which is a little bit more forgiving on your motors. So a guy like Steve New would probably be happy to hear that. Fewer motor smashes. And there are some rookie mistakes that we've seen just in the first 3 big contests that we've had in the U.S. The number one rookie mistake is that guys will tend to launch too low for the conditions, you know, just because they've heard that that's the cool thing to do in F5J, right? You want to out-launch your opponents by going lower. But it turns out that sometimes if the conditions are not conducive to any kind of thermal activity, in fact, what you want to do is you want to launch high enough so you can get your full duration. And in fact, the Visalia contest a few weeks ago was won by 2 guys with planes that were not light, but they went long distances and they went high, like nearly 200 meters, in order to be able to get their times. So it is definitely more of a game of strategy than just, you know, launching and finding air. And then finally, setup issues for beginning F5J pilots can be a little bit of an issue because the limiters have to be adjusted in such a way that if you're varying your motor speed, it doesn't mistakenly think you've turned the motor off, or conversely, it needs to know for sure that you've turned the motor off. And if you have your motor on a slider, sometimes the settings have to be tweaked a little bit for that. So that is fairly common when you're starting out. As far as equipment goes, what a lot of guys do starting out is just take their TD planes and get an electric fuse. And, you know, many of the vendors now are producing, I think most of the major ones are producing electric fuselages for, you know, all the standard F3J planes. That's what I did, and that's what I'm currently flying. I have an Explorer 2 4-meter wing and an electric fuse, and it actually flies really well. There is quite a bit of design activity going on in the contest plane production world that is all targeting F5J, which is more of a refined sport in Europe than it is in the U.S., but nonetheless, planes are coming out now. I'll just throw some numbers out if you're not familiar. You know, a typical high-end F3J plane that you buy today, you know, you can figure it's going to be in the high 50s to low 60s ounces. So they are now making 4-meter electrics that are specifically designed to be super light in F5J that are coming out in the mid to low 40-ounce range. And in fact, there are even a few that are building out in the high 30-ounce range. And these are full-span wings, but they're also very relatively delicate planes. But there's a lot of activity going on in that arena, and we've begun to see quite a few of those planes showing up at some of these U.S.-based contests. It's very interesting to watch. The question often comes up, well, how big of a motor do you need for these kinds of contests? And there's kind of a 2-part answer. If you have a removable nose cone and you can swap out motors, there are cases where it'd be nice to have a lighter motor and to get, you know, better wing loading so that you can catch lower and wispier thermals. On the other hand, there are also times when it's windy, and if you have an underpowered plane for F5J, you're going to have trouble moving around the field. And we saw that happen a lot at Vegas. We had the first day we actually got blown out after 2 rounds. There were quite a few planes that were built to be lighter, and they were underpowered, and they did not move around the field so well. So in my opinion, you know, you're better starting out making sure you've got enough motor to move around in a variety of conditions rather than just focusing on lighter conditions. As far as battery sizes go, there's a number of different ways guys go depending on how heavy or light their planes are. But what I'm seeing right now with the planes that are being set up to be as light as possible, and whether they're the ultralight planes or whether they're just planes like what I'm flying. A lot of guys are settling with batteries that are down in the 850 milliamp hour range. And what that means is after a couple of flights, you have to swap out with a fresh charged battery. But it gives you a really nice advantage in terms of, a lot less weight than what you would carry if you had a 13 to 1500 milliamp hour battery in it. And these are all LiPos, obviously. And just recently, there's been some development work with a new version of HV LiPos, silicon graphene LiPos now are available, and they have 10% more energy, and they've got a higher C rating, and they work very well. They've got a smaller size factor that in some of the tighter fuses that are being produced now, they actually fit very nice. So guys are beginning to use those batteries. And they haven't been out very long, but they seem to be working very well. And then finally, the limiters that you need if you're going to be in an F5J contest. If you're doing a club contest and you're just having fun, then what you can do is just allow guys to use their AOS limiters. And for the start height, you take the limiter setting plus 8 meters. That 8 meters takes into account the average zoom after the limiter itself cuts out. But there are two vendors that have become fairly popular in the U.S. There's an Altus device by Aerobtech and CAM F5J by Soaring Circuits made in the U.S. Those are two fairly popular limiters you can buy, and they're not that expensive. I think they're like between 55 and 75 bucks. So the contest coming up, a lot of guys are really excited about it, including me. I love the Hollister field. If you've never been there, you should go. It's a great field to fly in, lots of really nice irrigated green grass and varied terrain. I'm going to be helping Don with CDing, and Dave has done a great job of organizing it and getting things set up. He's been very efficient and very thorough in terms of planning, and we still have work to do, but already he has the entry set up on f3xevents.com, and pilots are starting to sign up for it. So we think that's going to be a pretty good deal. And this contest is on the F5J USA Tour, which is going to attract more guys to come because now there have been 3 events in the season so far, and guys are starting to seriously look at the standings and figure, I guess I better fly in a few more of these if I'm gonna move up. So it adds to the excitement. And already guys I know from SoCal and from Phoenix have been talking about how in the world they're going to fit this in their schedule, but they're doing it and they're coming, so it's going to be fun. There is going to be a tour sponsor for each one of these events, and I can't quite announce who it's going to be for the Hollister event, but there is going to be one, and we'll have a drawing, so that will probably bring some more guys along too. I'm not going to take time right now to show you, but if you're more interested in learning about F5J, and if you're interested especially in looking at what the current calendar looks like, we have a lot of contests on the calendar for this year. It's really pretty impressive for the first year. You can go to www.f5j-usa.com, and there's good information. There's a calendar. There's an F5J primer. If you want to look at the rules, the FAI rules, there's a whole page of information about the F5J USA Tour. There's an application, online application, if you're a club and you want to run an event and become an event on the tour. I should mention there's a deadline of June 30th this year if you want to have something for the 2017 season. So just be aware the deadline is coming up pretty quickly. And then there's other information. We have a listing of suppliers and clubs that do F5J. So it's a pretty good place to park if you want to learn more about that particular sport and that contest format. Okay, that's it for my formal chat, and now if there are questions, I'd be happy to take any.
Anybody? Okay, Tim, I'll repeat it for the.
How many watts motors you ready?
Did you catch that? How many watts are the motors you're running with?
So a lot of the motors that that we're running are pulling, 450 to 500 watts during the burn. And what typically happens is, when the batteries are peaked right off the charger, for the first 2 or 3 seconds, you get a pretty good peak of current and power, and then they tend to level off. The lighter planes can actually make do with less motor. And this would be the topic of another discussion. Talk about more of the details of your motor selections, but Steve New has a good range of motors depending on whether you want your plane to launch and go straight up, or if you're looking for a more conservative launch. Just one example, there are actually even some setups guys are doing now where rather than using a 3S LiPo pack, they're using a 2S LiPo pack so that they can drive the receiver and servos directly off the same voltage source that the motor is. But you need a motor that can run efficiently at 2S. Most of the motors, most of the systems that are set up that I see for contests now are using 3S battery packs with motors from a variety of companies.
You kind of mentioned the launch angle. So what's kind of a typical launch angle, like 45 degrees or straight up, or what does that look like?
That's a good question. So this is actually tangential to the issue of when you're launching, you want to be able to estimate how high you are, and there's a couple of reasons for that, not just that you don't want to exceed 200 meters. What I do, and what some guys do, is when you're setting up your plane, and yes, when I launch, I typically launch at 45 degrees, unless I want to make a run for a particular part of the field, then maybe you'll go up 50 meters and then go straight ahead and then climb again. But most of the time, I'm climbing at about 45 degrees, and I know because I have my motor speed set when I launch to the amount of power that will get me up at 10 meters a second. So I know if I'm launching at 5 seconds, I'm going to be up about 50 meters. If I'm at 10 seconds, I'm about at 100. And it's kind of interesting, but even in wind, you get the same benefit. It's just your plane isn't getting as far away from you. It's going up more than it's going out. But you can get within 5 meters just using that method. So yeah, I usually launch at about 45 degrees, but it's a personal choice. I see some guys always going straight forward. Sometimes you want to choose a little different angle just to get away from, the neighbors on your right and left who are launching at the same time you are. So you might modify your strategy just to keep give yourself a little bit more distance, depending on how much spacing there is between the lanes. It depends from field to field.
Stephen?
What is it about F5J that makes it a strategy more complicated than any other use?
Yeah, so the question is, how come you said it was chess versus checkers? Maybe be specific on why the strategy's more complex with the F5J?
Well, let's just do a direct comparison between F5J and AILS. The thing that you're doing in AILS is always trying to achieve, for example, my club, the Sacramento Club, they always have their limiter set at 200 meters. So in effect, in that format, you have 30 seconds to get up to 200 meters, and you can do it any way you want, but ultimately you're going to end up at the same height everybody else is. And the difference between AILS in that case and F5J is, in F5J, you're always thinking about how many points you can shave off of your launch penalty. So it's no longer just a simple, turn your motor on and go high. Now you're thinking, okay, are there thermals that are well developed enough where I can go up to 50 meters or 80 meters or 100 meters and then just cut off and hook up something a little bit lower, a little bit harder, but if you're successful, you beat the next guy who launched to 150 meters. So that's sort of the first, case where it's more a game of chess than it is checkers. You actually are looking for lift as you're launching. And one of the things that many of us do, as opposed to an AILS where most guys I'm aware of, they don't vary the speed of their motor when they're launching. They just, full speed, and they're either going straight out to a place and then straight up, or, they're just climbing at an angle until they reach 200 and then it cuts off. In F5J, I'll tell you how I have my plane set up. I have my motor speed on a slider. And when I know thermal conditions are fairly decent, I'll launch to about 50 meters, and then I'll drop my motor speed down to 50 to basically idle, and I'll idle around for 15 to 20 seconds looking for a bump. If I find one, I may decide that I'm going to cut my motor and take my chances. But it's a very different game from AILS in that regard, and even in TD. I mean, in TD, you're still trying to get as high of a launch as you can. It's not the same in F5J. In F5J, you're constantly thinking about ways that you can shave those points. On the other hand, if the conditions are not good, then it's kind of the inverse. Instead of thinking how low can you launch, now you have to think how high do I have to go in order to get my full time. And maybe it's 200 meters, or maybe it's 150, but it involves judgment on the conditions and on your plane's ability to detect lift and all those things. So those are some examples of how different it is. It really is a case where it is not, you don't just flip the switch and launch. You're looking for air all the time, and you're looking for good justification for shutting off the motor sooner than the next guy, because that will turn into points for you. Keep in mind that you're not going to make the difference up in landings. It's going to be in duration and start height.
Okay.
How is the data transferred from the airplane to the scoring apparatus?
Yeah. So how does the data get from the airplane to the scorekeeper or the software you're using?
So these limiters have displays on them, and literally what you do, if it's a formal contest, then the line judge will come over and he'll look at your stopwatch and then look at your limiter. But in practice, it's up to the timer. The timer basically looks at the pilot will take the canopy off his plane when it's on the ground after he's landed, before he turns it off, and the timer will look at the reading. And the reading on these limiters, these F5J compliant limiters, will give you a readout in meters of your start height. And that becomes one of the three things you write down on your scorecard. You write the landing down as well, and then your duration time.
Okay, Steve?
Other things being equal, will a larger plane always do better than smaller ones?
Yeah, does size matter is the question. Is a big plane, does the big plane, win, or small planes can compete pretty well? Or
it's been a real interesting process just going through the first 3 two-day contests in the U.S. this year. The first one was in Phoenix in December. Second one was F5J in Vegas, where we had 40 pilots at that one, and then the one just recently, a few weeks ago in Visalia, where we had 18 pilots. They were all actually very skilled pilots. The conditions were different in each case. So, the question of whether size matters or not, first of all, most of the planes that are in the field, competing are either, somewhere between 3.8 and 4 meter wingspans. So if you're talking about wingspan, they all are pretty much the same. The weights are not pretty much the same. There's a significant difference between my electric Explorer 2 wing with an electric fuse compared to, say, one of the newer ultralight planes like an Ultima or a Plus, or anyway, there are fairly significant differences, but not in size, in weight. And depending on conditions, yeah, if you're a good pilot and you're gutsy, you can do some pretty aggressive low launches and do really well. But you have to be pretty confident that you're going to do that, because if you blow it and you don't get your time, then that low aggressive launch is all for naught. But no, I mean, size doesn't matter because they're all pretty much coming in at anywhere between 3.7 and 4 meters, and there does not seem to be a significant difference in performance between them. I mean, I suppose you can look at the airfoil data, and a bigger wing should theoretically perform better, but you know, it's pretty close. I mean, there are quite a few 3.8 meter planes and quite a few 4 meter planes, and I don't know if they're evenly divided, but it's in that range.
I'm going to get one more question over here, but maybe before we get more from South Bay, maybe we should open up the mics for John B. and Tully too. So maybe you can figure that out, and I'll get the next question over here.
What's the entry costs for doing that?
I mean, entry fees for the contest?
No.
Equipment.
Oh, equipment. Yeah, Chris, could you give a kind of a thumbnail sketch of if you're going to convert a plane or maybe buy a new one, how much investment is required to get into this?
Yeah, it is a good question, and my answer is, if you want to buy everything brand new and all the latest and greatest stuff, then yeah, you write a bigger check with more zeros on it. But there are used planes that are capable of doing the same kind of contest. They may not have the same wing loading that some of the newest ultralights do, but on the other hand, I would never recommend somebody just starting out doing this kind of contest that they, you know, invest $2,500 in a brand new Ultima with all the latest and greatest stuff in it if you're just starting out. So, I mean, let me give you an example. If you have a TD plane and it's a popular like an Explorer or one of the well-known brands, every one of those manufacturers will sell you an electric fuselage for that wing. And some will and some won't include the tail feathers with it. If you buy an electric fuse for the Explorers, they will. You get a set of tail feathers for that fuse as well. But you can buy the fuselages for as little as $400, and then you can buy a motor as powerful or as moderately powerful as you want. The rest of the components, like I said, the limiter itself is maybe $75. Battery packs are $20. I mean, the motor, if it's a good one, is gonna cost some. Then you've got the receiver, and then a couple of servos for the fuselage. On the other hand, if you want to build a brand new, latest and greatest ultralight, I mean, yeah, you can easily spend $2,500, $2,800 with everything. But it doesn't make sense to do that to start. I mean, I'm in this in a big way, and I'm still flying my electric Explorer. I'm not winning contests, but I am flying that. So that's the way I would go.
Okay. Now it still looks like the mics are blocked on our two guests. Is there a way to unblock those mics? Or maybe I do that.
So John or Tully, do you have a question? I see John just came on.
Yeah, I'm good, and just got to thank you for the presentation. It was really excellent, and it sounds like a fun venue. So thank you very much for presenting this. I have no questions.
Okay,
thank you, John.
great.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, Chris, this is Gary. I do have a question for you. If someone was to show up, simply with like a Radian or something that's a, off-the-shelf $200 aircraft, is that in any way competitive, or could it be competitive in the hands of yourself or Larry Jolly? Does it have to be something that's 4 meters?
Well, the way that I would imagine local clubs are going to want to do this is by creating a separate class. I mean, the way we do this at SBSS for AILS contests is to have a separate class for foamies and Radians. In the bigger contests that are part of the F5J USA Tour, we do not acknowledge classes per se. It just happens to be the way the FAI works, and we're following FAI scoring rules in the tour. But if you're talking about doing F5J contests locally, what I would do is I would definitely break it up into two groups, and I would call the main group open, and then create a group for foamies. And there is actually a way in Glider Score. Of course, we didn't talk at all about this tonight, but there is a very capable tool that is available for free. It's a donation-based product called Glider Score, and that's what we're going to be using at the Hollister event. Not only does it do F5J scoring, but it does smartphone scoring, so pilots can enter their scores themselves, which really offloads the scorekeeper's job, especially in the bigger events. But even in the small ones, it works great. We do practice contests at my club, and sometimes we only have 5 or 6 people coming, but we use the smartphone feature. So anyway, you can establish classes for your local club contests, and that's what I would do. I would establish 2 classes, an open class and a foamy class, and that way you can give recognition to all the guys who are flying the foamies. And you don't even need to have them buy the F5J compliant limiters. They can use their AILS limiters, and what they write down, like I said before, on their scorecard for starting height is the limiter cutoff height plus 8, and that gets pretty darn close to what the actual height is.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, I think having a foamy class would certainly help introduce people. Yep. I think that's a good thing. I had one other question. I know for things like F3K, between rounds, you can launch and do a little hunting to see what's around. Mainly because the F3K size gliders can't do the range that a 4-meter plane can do. But I'm just curious, between rounds for F5J, can you do any kind of poking around or not?
No. The way the contests are orchestrated, again using Glider Score, there's an automation portion to the program that allows you to write a script that completely defines the prompts that are announced, not only for the working time period where all the planes are up in the air, but also for the prep time period. So a typical contest, let's say a full day of flying on Saturday in a 2-day contest maybe would be 8 rounds. So what you can do is you can run the automation piece in Glider Score that will announce, typically we're using a 7-minute prep time, and that will be counted down not only with audio prompts on the loudspeaker system, but we also will be bringing wireless LED clocks. We will have a couple at Hollister, and pilots can always look up and just glance at the clock and see how much prep time they have left. But during the prep time, no plane is allowed to be in the air. So yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
Got it. Thanks.
Hey, any more questions on our side? Okay, well, thank you. That's it from us. Thank you, Chris. We really enjoyed it and learned a lot today.
Great.
So we appreciate it. Thanks for making your time with us.
My pleasure. Well, thanks for having me, and hope to see some of you guys out at Hollister.
Great, and thanks, Gary, for setting this up, too.
Not a problem. Applause for Chris.
Yay.
Thanks a lot.